Good afternoon to yet another in the series of our roundtables. This time we will be speaking about the rule of law, or as some people seem to understand it, about the right rule, and about the right kind of media, and about the right kind of state, and of course the rule of law. I deliberately chose a somewhat sarcastic title for this roundtable, and I know that it was not to everyone's liking, but I believe that those of you who understand the notions and keep track of what's going on understand my purpose. There are many thorny issues related to this subject matter, and I'm convinced that we have the right guests with us to answer them. I hope gentlemen will not resent if I first offer my greetings to the ladies on the panel. First and foremost, Vice President of the European Commission and the Commissioner for Values and Transparency, Mrs. Vera Jourova. We are very honored that you have taken the time to be with us. Thank you very much. And warm greetings also to Attorney at Law, Jasna Zakonšek, among other things, specialist for media law. Welcome. Furthermore, we have established a video link with my colleague, MEP from Slovakia, Michal Šimečka. By the way, the so-called media in the service of the truth, please do note his name correctly this time. We are not hosting his father. Hello, Michal. And then we also have with us Deputy Director of the International Press Institute, Mr. Scott Griffin. Welcome. And two expert lecturers, Professor of EU Law, Mr. Alberto Alemano, and Professor of Journalism and Media Policies, Marko Milosavljevic. Welcome to both of you. And we have another guest with us who is literally in the room. He's here, but last and not least, we have with us President of the Marjan Šarec list, the former Prime Minister of Slovenia, Mr. Marjan Šarec. Hello, dear Irena, and welcome to all the guests of this panel. I'm really happy that we will open up new horizons and speak about the media issues. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion with very competent guests. And I trust that after this roundtable is over, we will all be richer for a new experience and new insights. Yes, I also am extremely pleased that we have such a broad panel with us. I divided up this event into two sessions. In the first one, we will talk with Commissioner Jourova, MEP Šimečka, and Professor Alemano about a broader topic, about the European perspective on the matter at hand, while in the second part, we will engage in a debate with other guests and focus on the situation in Slovenia. Before we start, just a couple of technical clarifications for our audience. Since all our guests in the first panel come from abroad and will speak English, I will also speak English in this first part, but we do have simultaneous interpreting provided both into Slovene and English. The Slovene version is web streamed on Facebook and the English version on YouTube. All information is provided also in the Facebook live stream. I hope it's all working fine, and I suggest that we immediately start with the first session.
A lot is happening and the situation is deteriorating, sadly, not just in Hungary or Poland anymore, yet it seems that not much is getting done in the sense of concrete, tangible and final solutions. What do I mean by that? The European Union is based on the rule of law, and while the EU has been consistently and gradually evolving its political and legal structure, some unpredicted tensions of recent developments appeared within this structure. Namely, we weren't supposed to have this such sharp tools to stop the democratic backsliding or violations or fundamental rights or protect values among the member states within the EU. It was, supposed to be self-evident that we all act by the values and the principles. Nevertheless, the legal structure of the EU enables some actions from the EU institutions, of course, but those actions are almost always intertwined with political realities and constant tensions within the EU institutions and its member states. So what kind of tools do we have available? First, infringement procedures to take the member states to the European Court of Justice. The second part is the Article 7. And the third is the newly established rule of law mechanism. As far as the court rulings are concerned, many times they take a long time and damage is already done or cannot be reversed. Meanwhile, even though the Article 7 against Hungary and Poland was triggered years ago, and despite the endless urging from the Parliament, the developments remain stalled in the Council, while the rule of law situation continues to deteriorate in both countries and even wider. Portugal, currently holding the presidency, is not organizing a hearing because they cannot meet in person, while the upcoming Slovenian presidency, probably led by the current government, a known ally of Poland and Hungary, also doesn't assure any progress here. Yet, the reason for this discussion is the rule of law mechanism, envisioned by the Commission in 2018, based on the idea of linking the EU budget with the rule of law conditionality, which we managed to achieve in December last year, and now the regulation is in force since January. However, firstly, compared to the original proposal, the regulation was quite watered down in the negotiations between the Parliament and the Council, and also it was limited in scope. Secondly, the European Council summit of the head of governments in December ended with the statement in a so-called political compromise that before triggering this mechanism, the Commission must develop and adopt guidelines for applying the regulation, which will be finalized after the judgment of the ECJ. The purpose of such regulation is, of course, to protect the EU budget, meaning to protect the taxpayers' money all over Union from abuse and corruption, and as a preventive tool to stop the democratic backsliding or violations of the rule of law in the Union. Additionally, I think it's important to note that this mechanism is not intended for specific countries, but it's applied to all member states on objective criteria. Therefore, all of the accusations that this is a tool to discipline the member states is, in my opinion, an argument ill-conceived, but it is also true that there are more violations of rule of law in specific member states. Now, what I want to know is, have we learned enough from the cases of Poland and Hungary for the third is a charm state or case not to happen? With this question in mind, I will now slowly move to Commissioner Jourova's part. I know, dear Commissioner, that you have a very busy schedule and that unfortunately you cannot stay with us until the end. Still, I really do appreciate you being here. You have heard my part, and I would especially like to hear your comments about the current state of affairs, because Hungary and Poland have challenged the regulation before the ECJ, as implied in the European Council conclusion. Maybe you could give us some details about the objective guidelines that the Commission is preparing, and especially with the regulation being already valid, whether we are waiting for those guidelines or the court rulings or not. It would be maybe interesting to know, will this mechanism be triggered automatically and retrospectively? Also, I think it is important to explain how would the mechanism ensure that its implementation would not endanger the citizens of the state whose governments are violating the rule of law. I mean, we all here know that you're not, of course, against any member state and that you're striving for objective criteria to be applied in all states equally. But, for example, the authorities in Hungary have accused you of acting against Hungary. They even declared you persona non grata. And speaking of, due to your views on the media freedom and primarily because of your comments on the Slovenian press agency situation here in Slovenia, you are not, how should I say, you are not the most popular with many members of the current Slovenian government too. So to cut to the chase, what are we going to really do to really prevent such situations from occurring all around the Union, while also stop the democratic backsliding of any additional member states, as we know that at least one country besides Hungary and Poland is on its way to join them. So please, Commissioner, thank you, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Madam Jourova. Thank you for the invitation to deliver this speech in the event focused on the rule of law in the EU. just one personal comment to begin with. I think that if somebody enters politics to be popular, it must be followed by horrible disappointment, because this is almost never the case. And I am here to do my job. I received the portfolio to protect the values, and it seems to be unpopular with many, but also popular with many others. So I receive also a lot of support and courage from many people who also see that if we do nothing against the backsliding of the values like the rule of law and fundamental rights and democracy, then we will get into the trap of the bad past. And I remember bad past. I am the former citizen of Czechoslovakia, and I remember the totalitarian regime very well. But I'm here to explain how I see the use of the new tool, which is the conditionality between the budget and rule of law, which is indeed the new tool, which is complementing the other tools we have to address the problems appearing in the member states, the problems in the field of the rule of law. And indeed, as you said, the first moment of this idea, I remember well, I said it for the first time in Vienna in 2017. And then it was a really big negative reaction from many sides, including the countries who are net contributors to the budget. Something like, this is incredible, this is unimaginable, we cannot apply such a rule. And then over time, I didn't believe much that it will ever be adopted. So the December moment when you say it was watered down, I don't believe so. I am, first of all, glad that it survived the processes, and they were not easy, and it required a lot of efforts. But also that in the current shape and form, it is applicable to fulfill its role. So I want to say where we are now. You are right that the regulation applies from the 1st of January 2021, and we are in the Commission fully committed to enforce it based on monitoring and assessment as from that date. But we need to prepare all the steps that can ensure a successful application of this new tool. You have maybe heard me speaking many times about infringements on the rule of law, saying that when we send cases to the court, we must be absolutely certain of our assessment to ensure that the court comes to conclusions in line with our own findings. In other words, we cannot afford to lose the cases at the Court of Justice, because too much is at stake here. This is about the rule of law principle, which is at the very core of the foundations of the EU. So the Commission believes that always the solid preparatory work and absolute legal certainty must be present when we not only are submitting the cases to the European Court of Justice, but also when we are facing the cases submitted by others. And this is the case now. Poland and Hungary already submitted their proposal, their maybe proposals to the Court of Justice so that the court has the last say, and the Court of in Luxembourg always has the last say on the legality of such tool. And for me, this moment is important to start the application of the tool, having very steady ground under our feet, that the tool will be declared legal by the highest authority, which has the only as the only body the role to interpret the EU law, and that we can start quite safely from the legal point of view to apply to apply this new rule. And so we are now in full speed of preparing the guidelines on some aspects of the application of the regulation, such as how to ensure complementarity with other instruments, the proportionality of the measures, the details of the procedure, and most important, the impact on final beneficiaries. You mentioned it also, Madam Joveva. We try to apply this without how to put it, damaging the final beneficiaries' interests in the member states. And here comes my personal weak point, because I was working 20 years in the sector or in the field of EU funding. And I saw so many very useful projects which really increased the standard of living in our countries. And I saw how heavily needed the money, the EU money, is in the member states. And this is twice the truth now in the COVID time. So we have to think about the proportionality of the measures, and we have to think about the impact on the beneficiaries, and not only think, we have to embed these elements into the guidelines, which will shed light on how the processes will work and how the new tool will be applied. There are a lot of detailed questions which the regulation has not answered. For instance, the retroactivity issue, the many procedural questions. Well, the guidelines will have to be very practical and transparent document, which will be consulted with the member states. And I'm sure that the European Parliament will also be looking at how the guidelines are designed. Definitely, we are not going to further water down the regulation. We just need to bring clarity on how it will work in practice, in line with the regulation. So that's one track of our work. The second track, the parallel track, is the start of the monitoring and screening of the situation in the member states, because as you can imagine, to trigger the process relating to concrete member state, we need to collect a lot of data and facts regarding the situation in the member state based on the criteria which are present in the regulation. And it's different set of criteria from what we have under Article 7 or criteria which we use for applying the infringements. So this requires a lot of fresh analytical work to assess the situation and to come to a conclusion that it can be triggered. And this conclusion must be based on absolute certainty that there is the failure in the rule of law principle, which does harm to EU money. And we need to prove this bridge. So we have plenty of work to build the case relating to concrete states, and to be absolutely certain that we can trigger the procedure. And I sometimes hear the criticism that we apply double standards and we are not respecting the equal treatment. So I want to assure you that we will assess alleged breaches in an objective, impartial, and fair manner, with respecting the principle of proportionality. And I am convinced that the use of this new tool, the first decisions we take, will be challenged before the court. This is why I want to be very methodical and very diligent, and also very transparent. We cannot afford to make a mistake if we want this tool to be effective. This is in the interest of all of us who care about the rule of law. This must not be a gesture to apply the tool. It must be the result of the proper analytical work and of the very a highly responsible political decision. And this is what we are ready to do. So this is where we are. I'm afraid I speak too long, but maybe a few more comments. For taking measures under the regulation, any breach of the rule of law has to affect or seriously risk affecting the sound financial management of the union budget or the protection of the financial interests of the union in a sufficiently direct way. This is the breach I spoke about. And the mechanism can only apply to the new money, so to the new budget and the next generation EU money, and not to the running expenditures under the old MFF. This is also one of the things we have to clarify in the guidelines, that which money it will apply to, because still the old budget is financing the projects in the member states, and we must not mix this up. The regulation complements other procedures established by union legislation to protect the EU budget, including OLAF and newly the European Public Prosecutors investigations. The EPPO will start functioning in June this year. I hope. We are doing everything to make this happen. We will continue to use all instruments available to effectively protect the EU budget, including, for instance, the early detection and exclusion system, checks and audits, or financial corrections. This is not purely new thing to stop the funding in the EU. And now, sorry, I have to be a little bit technical. The EU has a rich tradition to freeze the money to the member state where there is the failure to have the properly functioning audit and control system. I was the minister responsible for the funding when we had the frozen money. It was really a difficult situation, and we need to speed up to correct the system. So with this conditionality, we go one floor above. So among other things, you can see in the regulation that if we have doubts that the judiciary system works, or prosecution, or the procurement procedures functioning, then we can apply this tool. So just to tell you that we have the tradition in freezing the money, but I think that this new conditionality is something higher and maybe something more important and less technical. So I don't want to speak too long, but I think I have exhausted a lot of things which I wanted to tell you. From the EU perspective, again, I have to come back to the term rule of law, because sometimes it is by many just reduced to the functioning of judiciary system, and we see the rule of law in broader terms. For instance, in the rule of law report, as you know, which is annually now planned to be updated, the next one will come in July this year. Now we are running the country missions, so it's also the case of Slovenia. We have that broader concept where we also cover not only independence of the judiciary, but also fight against corruption, media freedom and pluralism, and constitutional checks and balances. So I am aware that you will discuss today also more specifically, rather than these general matters, the situation in Slovenia. So let me refer briefly to some issues mentioned in the last report. In the report, there are a number of positive aspects, such as the fact that Slovenia has the legal and institutional framework for preventing and fighting corruption broadly in place. At the same time, the Commission has made its concerns very clear when it comes to media freedom and pluralism. we see in particular frequent verbal attacks against journalists, and this is not acceptable. We are also seriously concerned by the continuous attempts to undermine the sustainable funding and the independence of the National Press Agency in Slovenia. And so we are following the situation in Slovenia with concern, and we expect that swift solutions can be found. You have probably noticed that the Commission is now doing much more than in the past to support the media in the EU. And especially now in COVID context, we are witnessing the paradoxical situation when we need the media most, when we need the information, when we need somebody to bring objective facts and assessment of the facts. We see that the media are under stronger and stronger pressure, not only from economic point of view, but also from the political pressure aspects or perspective. And the security of journalists is worsening. So I would like all the member states to go in the same direction, to recognize the role of the media as not only an economic player, but also as one of the pillars of the democracy. And rather than oppress them and make their lives and functioning more difficult, to support them and to help them to survive this very difficult period, difficult for all, and media alike. So this is how I see the situation. I wish you a fruitful debate, I guess mainly about Slovenia. And I want to stress at the end, referring to the reaction of Mr. Janša, that I am with you at this panel. I am accepting invitations, whoever from. And I like also the debates where there is a confrontation, where I can defend the position of the Commission, where I can hopefully efficiently explain why we are doing many things to defend the rule of law and fundamental rights and democracy. Why? Because simply it's not automatic. These values will not defend themselves. And it's our role to do that. So I just want to say that if I am invited by some other maybe representatives of the European Parliament or national parliaments, those who work with me know that I am always available for a discussion, for open discussion and for cooperation with open cards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Commissioner, for your comments and for the details you have given us. Also for this last comment, I completely agree with everything that you said. Thank you again for taking the time and being here with us. Stay safe and all the best, of course. I think you have given us also more than enough basis for the further conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. So I will go now to the next two speakers. Firstly, to my colleague Šimečka. I will start with you. In the Parliament, especially our political family, so the Renew Europe, has really fought very hard in the negotiations with the Council to keep the broader scope of the regulation. We achieved that the independence of the judiciary state, and we were also very critical of the European Council conclusions. So our position is, of course, clear. We called for an expedited procedure within the ECJ and even threatened the Commission to take them to court. Why was this necessary, and how do you see this political compromise? And I mean, why would anybody be against this regulation? And maybe, of course, also if you have any comments on what Commissioner Jourova said.
Yes, thank you very much, and it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be able to join you on this discussion on a crucial topic at a crucial time in a crucial country from this perspective as well, although obviously virtually. First of all, perhaps a general comment before a few remarks, obviously, on the regulation and on the Parliament's position, and also on what Madam Vice President was saying. But as perhaps a general introduction, it seems to me that we've been having these debates over the past year or even obviously longer, but definitely in this parliament, over how the European Union should finally kind of get a grip on the rule of law and democracy crisis of its values. And it's true that, you know, a lot has been done in terms of new tools. I mean, we have the rule of law reports. Now we have this regulation. Obviously, we have additional and existing tools, Article 7, and we have the infringement proceedings against, say, Hungary and Poland for breaches of rule of law. The problem is that, or at least I'm getting increasingly frustrated that while we sort of pat ourselves on the back as the EU of how we're, you know, building these new institutions and tools and stuff, but the problem is that the situation on the ground is sort of all the time getting worse. And this is what worries me, that we have lots of debates in the parliament, we have lots of resolutions, we have fancy new tools, but they're all kind of a bit sort of catching up with events. And it's not just obviously the events in Hungary and kind of the attack on independence of the judiciary in Hungary, which is by now almost irreversible, despite the number of rulings by the European Court of Justice, the number of infringement proceedings, despite Article 7. We obviously the situation in Hungary, which again seems, especially when it comes to the media, which by now there's you know, the entire scene of free media is by now, you know, disintegrated by various moves, commercial or governmental from the Orban regime. So it seems to me, you know, while we're talking and building tools, you know, facts on the ground are being created, and obviously there's lots of concern that, especially when it comes to the media, and especially public media, that you might see a similar dynamic in some other member states, that before the EU realizes that, you know, that this is a problem, that it's already, you know, already misses the train. And specifically, I mean, obviously Slovenia, when it comes to media freedom, has been mentioned in this context. So this is kind of a general remark, that while we can be satisfied that the EU obviously has, you know, moved a lot since the Lisbon Treaty, but it's nowhere near enough, because simply those illiberal forces, or those bent on you know, destruction of rule of law, are moving much faster before we can apply our instruments. And that kind of also bridges to the discussion on the regulation. Again, this is it's great that we have it. We should have had it years ago. You know, the notion that European money and the disbursement of European funds should be conditional on the adherence to the basic norms and values and rules that we all subscribe to in the Union, and that especially if this money is paid for by all Europeans and taxpayers. I mean, this is common sense, and this should have been in place all along. But it's okay. It's good that we have it now. Obviously, a belated response to the rule of law crisis. But frankly, before we get it operational, before the guidelines are published, before the European Court of Justice delivers its ruling, it might be too late for Hungary. Obviously, given the electoral calendar. So I have to say I'm frustrated again, and there's one additional element to this with this particular regulation, that not only was it watered down in the autumn during the negotiations, although I have to say that the Parliament, and especially thanks to the existence of the Parliament, the kind of general provisions on the independence of the judiciary are there. So it's not just a tool for fighting corruption, but it's actually a tool for protecting rule of law and taxpayers' money. But nonetheless, it's been watered down. The way it can be triggered is watered down from the reverse conditionality mechanism. But most importantly, there was a deal struck at the European Council, which is not particularly standard. That you have the prime ministers and heads of state instructing the European Commission, or essentially maybe not instructing, but sort of guiding the European Commission to not apply EU law, which is, as of January the 1st, on the books. And the European Commission, we might recall, is duty bound and treaty bound to apply EU law. So this is also why the Parliament, is really pushing for this instrument to be applied as soon as possible, because otherwise, as I mentioned in the beginning, it might simply be too late. And this kind of compromise that emerged at the European Council is just just another, to me, it's just another evidence that when push comes to shove, and when obviously the entire EU budget is on the line, then Orban and the Polish leaders, and I hope not, but potentially in the future some other illiberal leaders, can manipulate the rest of the EU, and those powerful leaders and prime ministers simply don't have the courage to stand up to them. So it's not a particularly good omen. But I understand that Madam Vice President of the Commission wants to be careful, because if the Commission makes a mistake now, it's going to be a bad precedent and set us back years. But this cautious approach is not working. Simply look at the situation in Poland, in Hungary, and some other member states, and it's simply not working. So that's probably for my. Sorry to be going on for a bit long, but I think this was important to be said.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Michal. Now I will go to you, Professor Alemano. You were quite critical of the European Parliament's legal service, and actually with some of your colleagues you even proposed that you could legally represent the Parliament pro bono. So what are your comments until what you heard now on this roundtable, and what can or should we do now to speed the things up?
Thank you, Irene, Joveva, and also Michael, for this opportunity to share a few reflections on the situation. I regret the Commissioner couldn't stay with us to listen our conversations and to respond to our questions, because obviously we have a lot of questions to ask her. It is no mystery that the academic, judicial community, but also civil society, is losing passions and remains puzzled by some of the arguments in the overall strategy Michael alluded to. The fact that the Commission is afraid to lose a case before the Court of Justice is unfortunately a very implausible argument. The Court of Justice is the ultimate authority whose job is to uphold the rule of law, but the court cannot task itself. It needs somebody to go before it, and this is the European Commission. So that argument is not very convincing, in particular, given the nature of the breaches we're discussing, given the fact that the same Court of Justice has been already judged a lot of behavior as against the rule of law, and those judgments today remain unsatisfied, meaning they have not been complied with by those states, and the Commission is not bringing those states before the court again under Article 260, if not in exceptional circumstances. This in itself is slightly suspicious. So I agree with Michael. This approach of taking the time and trying to show to the world that they're doing their homework is simply not credible. And it clearly transpires a lack of political will, which is not Ms. Jourova's will, but is the college, as epitomized by Ms. von der Leyen, who is clearly not using the full prerogatives that exist for the Commission to uphold the rule of law. It is not only about judgment not be complied, it is also about not using or asking for interim measures when introducing infringement actions when those are needed. It's also about not introducing infringement actions when the breach is manifest, like in the case of the composition of the Constitutional Court in Poland, as the Parliament and the same Commission had recognized. So this is somehow paradoxical, right? Everybody is seeing that the Commission is doing its preparatory work up to a point, and then when is the point to actually push the button? Think about Article 7, as Irene remember, we never had such a vote, right? We know there will be this kind of veto, mutual veto between Poland and Hungary. We never reached that stage. So again, this situation, I think, has been going on for too long. And I think your question is a much more interesting question. In other words, how can we potentially go out? Can we overcome such an impasse? And I think we cannot let alone the Commission. We cannot simply obsess on the Commission doing its job, because what we're witnessing today is something much deeper, right? If you have been reading Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes' analysis, saying, well, at the end of the day, liberalism hasn't been taken into account major questions of redistribution and equality, which in Central European countries have caused major divides in the population. And this is what caused certain political parties to emerge. This is a much deeper debate that shows that the Commission technically has all the prerogatives it needs, but politically is not well supported because it doesn't have a political majority within this parliament and in the council to feel comfortable to play its role. Sorry to speak a bit, how can I say, in a free manner by saying what I feel, what I observe, but the situation is very dire and it won't improve in the coming weeks or months. This is the political approach which is there to stay till 2024. And this means that we're going to see many more acceleration in the breaches of the rule of law. And the precedent that Michael reminded us, the UCO conclusions of last December, de facto suspending the application of a regulation, is simply represent the cherry of the cake. The Commission saying we cannot use this instrument because we need to prepare guidelines, which were not even foreseen by the regulation, is deeply problematic. This would deserve the Commission be brought before the Court of Justice for a failure to act, exactly what the Parliament has been written in its own resolution. I really hope that some of this political will, which is a bit of a minority, I mean, is formally a majority, but is not very strong, will translate into action. I really hope so. Perhaps a few concluding words on what to do, because again, this is your question beyond the diagnosis. It's important, the diagnosis, but it's also important to think how we can get out of this current situation. How do we generate the political dynamics that would push the European Union to make full use of the instruments available? Again, the law alone doesn't suffice. We need something more. And we need to look for support in the political process, but also in civil society. I think Europe today would look very different, and the Commission would have found the political courage it lacked today if civil society managed to be more vocal and more aware. What does it mean? It means about trying to use horizontally the mechanism we have. We cannot leave the Commission alone to be the guardian of the treaties. We need to empower states to be able to introduce infringement action against those countries. Why? Because the lack of judicial independence in Poland or in any other country is affecting citizens living, residing in another member of the European Union. The cross-border effect of the breach of the rule of law are already felt in Europe, and this justifies member states' action. At the same time, we can imagine NGOs and a panoply of other actors to use the tool available in the treaties to actually create this pressure, not only on the Commission, but also on the relevant member states. We are not even trying to do so. Our civil society organizations are not necessarily using those possibilities by showing that the Commission can rely on civil society at the transnational level because there is a demand for action. I don't see this happening from the bottom up, but the bottom up could be a major differentiating factor in that particular approach. Final point, why companies, big corporations that are benefiting from regulatory regimes, tax regimes in countries where the rule of law is breached are not also speaking out. And I know some companies, which are not necessarily those favored by the current ruling parties, that would be ready to speak out, but for companies, difficult to get political. But if certain companies, if certain investors would stop their economic activities by becoming much more political in the way in which they claim the economic space they need to thrive, obviously the answer from the political system would be very different. All these levers of change are not even visible. We are not even discussing them. But given the current impasse in the approach of the European Commission, which is there to stay, we need to be creative. And we have to connect the dots among these different actors and creating what I call an enabling environment for the rule of law to become a reality, not simply an abstract concept, but something that really is changing people's life and even economic dynamics. I close on this, but happy to continue the conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Professor Alemano. Michal, back to you. I'm sure that you will probably also have a comment on what Professor Alemano said. But additionally, I would maybe like to ask you also about the media freedom issues, because given the severe problems with it, how can we protect the media autonomy if we cannot use the rule of law mechanism to do so? So should we be able to use the mechanism also here? And the same goes also for other areas such as the protection of civil society, NGOs, and so on. So please, Michal.
Thank you, Anna. First of all, on media freedoms, this is notoriously difficult for the European Union to intervene in these matters, because I mean there's all sorts of legal arguments that the European Union that is outside of the competence of the EU. I don't buy into that, actually. First of all, when it comes to freedom of the media, it is part of, and when Madam Vice President talked about the rule of law, she specifically said, and I fully agree, that when we speak about the rule of law, it's not just about institutions of the criminal justice system, which is exactly why the European Parliament wanted to have a rule of law mechanism, both for monitoring and for enforcement, that sort of covers the full scope of European values, including democracy, including fundamental rights, and frankly, including freedoms such as freedom of the media, freedom of the press. So this should fall under the general scope of whenever we talk about the kind of rule of law instruments that the EU has. This I think this should indeed be a part of it, as should fundamental rights, as should democracy, integrity of elections. These are all things that I think not only should be part of the annual report, but should also be part of any enforcement mechanism. So kind of that's because in reality, what you see in many member states, and Hungary is a good example, and I hope Slovenia will not be, but for the moment, what you see, and in Poland as well, is that destruction of the rule of law in the traditional sense, being independence of judiciary, checks and balances, often goes hand in hand with violation of fundamental rights, or indeed suppression of freedom of the media. It is often part of the same political context and same political reality, because it's part of the same political strategy of that ruling party. So you can't kind of see it outside of this context that it's somehow we only look at the EU, we're only concerned by whether your judges are appointed by politically independent process, or whether how well your prosecution works. I mean, it absolutely has everything to do with whether the public broadcaster is independent of political control, or whether there is enough freedom for public media or for journalists themselves to pursue their work, or whether a country does not, or government does not engage in discrimination against minorities, or in hate, in hate speech. All of this, unfortunately, in the empirical context that we're seeing, and specifically in Hungary and Poland, goes hand in hand. The problem with, or the problem, the LGBTI free zones are intricately linked to the destruction of the Polish independent justice. It's the same problem in a way, and failure of the EU so far has been seeing it that way. It only sees kind of just a very narrow section of it, and I think media definitely should be part of that full picture. So that's kind of a more general comment. And when it comes to the sort of tools that we can, they're actionable, so to speak. I think, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the EU has plenty of powers when it comes to competition law, when it comes to and this could apply to the media sector. I mean, you have instances, and again, looking at Hungary and Poland, where you have private media, especially media critical of the government, squeezed out of advertising, where you have unfair practices, you have monopolies being created, or all of these things. So in a way, the Commission could have a look at the tools related to the internal and to the single market and to competition and state aid to actually act against suppression of freedom of media. And I remember when we had the debate in plenary with Madam Vice President, and she actually said that the Commission is looking into new tools how to protect journalists and protect the media. And so I'm still, waiting for that to be announced. And last but not least, obviously, what the EU should be doing is supporting journalists financially, politically. We will have a new budget. We have the new rights and values program. I think that definitely there has to be a dedicated kind of budget line for supporting independent journalism, both at national level as well as local level. Because as we know, as Timothy Snyder keeps reminding us, this is the single most important thing any of us can do to save democracy is to buy a local newspaper. So I think this again is something that the European Union could and should do.
Thank you, Michal. Actually, more or less the same question for you, Professor Alemano. What do you think about this possible connection between the rule of law and the media? Should it be more connected and more sharp tool for these situations?
No doubt. I fully agree with what Michael has been saying so far. There are loopholes, there are inconsistencies in the way in which the rule of law toolbox came into being. Also, the rule of law report should actually play a much greater role in terms of evidentiary burden to be used then in infringement actions and in the conditionality regulation. This is not the case. And as you might have noticed today, this is also used as an excuse, as a justification, as a tactic to somehow delay the way in which the Commission should be using those competences and prerogatives. So paradoxically, the fact of having enlarged the toolbox has not accelerated the use of the tools, has actually created some further, I would say, difficulties for those of us who actually expect those tools to be used, to be put in full use by the Commission itself. This is a real paradox, is an unintended consequences. Obviously, we were all very well intentioned to push for an improvement of those tools. But when you look at the reality today, also the political reality, not only the legal one, you clearly see that there are major inconsistencies. On the Slovenia story, I think it's a bit too early to say, but it is clear that the Commission has a lot of entry points to be used exactly in the same way we have seen infringement actions using the angle of the internal market for the telecom market in many countries, not only in Central European countries, also in a country like Italy, which I know well because that's where I come from. And there's no reason why they should not be used here. However, the current situation in Slovenia still deserves some scrutiny because there's been a lot of constitutional hardball, as was described in Verfassung blog today, the tactic of the president to somehow get the attention and to disrupt the political system by aligning itself. But there are also economic interests which certainly would deserve, given the overall framework, some action today. In a nutshell, I think that we are seeing a situation in which the critical infrastructure of the European Union is lacking. We don't have European political parties today visible to the citizens, able to raise their voice, and we don't see a European pan-sphere, a pan-European sphere that is somehow fostering a debate whereby citizens in neighboring countries, say in Germany or in Austria, might be interested in knowing what is happening to the media landscape in Slovenia. This remains a little bit the original scene of the current situation. And that's why I think the report that I read from Ruiz de Vesa only from last week on the rule of law clearly make an argument along the line suggested by Michael. So really strengthening and ensuring more consistency in the tools available in order to strengthen this critical infrastructure of our European democracy. This is a way to go. And interesting enough, the same member of the European Parliament is also responsible for the reform of the electoral law. And this is the other piece of the puzzle, I think, to get this right before 2024.
Thank you, Professor Alemano. Before I thank you both for attending, because unfortunately we are already short of time, I will give you just a minute or two for each of you to maybe make some final remarks, maybe also emphasize the situation in Slovenia, and just one question for maybe to provide some food for thought for the final comment. Why do you think, Michal, that the methods of some Eastern leaders seem more authoritarian and try to create a cultural or historical struggle, even if we know that it is not about that? It's about the equal opportunities and respecting the basic values fundamental to the democratic system.
Thank you very much, Ian. Although I can't possibly imagine how I can answer that in 1 minute, because that is a huge question you just posed there. I mean, obviously, I can try to answer and try to sort of explain a bit, you know, the kind of the central Eastern European perspective and sort of historical context and political context. But I would want to make this final point. And first of all, obviously, it's pure propaganda what Orban and the likes, and I'm sure you hear that from the Slovenian government, is saying that all of these sort of, you know, rule of law talk or talk of media freedom or, you know, Article 7 and all these things are just made up, you know, arguments by Brussels or the liberals to punish countries which are conservative or are against immigration or whatever. I think, and this is something that, you know, we have to be able to dismiss, you know, out of hand, because everybody who reads those regulations or this or you know, reads those materials, it's absolutely clear what it is about. That it's about, you know, it's about rule of law, it's about independent justice, it's about access to justice, it's about freedom of the media, as we have in our constitutions, by the way. So the reason why they're making that argument, that propaganda, is obviously clear, because this is, you know, politically expedient. I'm not sure this is specifically Central Eastern European. I think I could well imagine it happening in some other country, even West European and Southern European country. And this is the final point that I would like to make. And this is that we're obviously discussing about this crisis of values. We're seeing, you know, journalists being murdered in Slovakia and Malta, now in Greece. We're seeing, you know, huge pressure by the government, by the Prime Minister on public media and intimidation and harassment of journalists in Slovenia. And we think that we have to do something because of the values themselves, which we hold dear and which we are, you know, absolutely convinced that they lead to best possible governance. And that's true. But also, and I also should stress that this is also about the survival of the European Union in practical terms. Because if we allow, you know, one or two member states or more member states to basically, you know, become entrenched illiberal countries or less than democracies, or even sort of hybrid regimes or non-democracies, then that's going to be the beginning of the European Union, because it cannot function like that. We cannot have a union in which, you know, some member states are democracies, other member states are sort of, you know, halfway between democracies and dictatorships, and then you have a couple of, you know, authoritarian leaders in it. This is not going to work, because the European Union, for it to function, for the internal market to function, for the Schengen system to function, for the euro to function, for all the policies, you know, you absolutely have to have that kind of trust between the member states, between their leaders and between their administrations and their judges and their parliamentarians to sustain that, because the European Union is not doesn't have a federal government which could sort of impose, you know, these common policies. They are sustained by that trust, and that trust, on the other hand, is sustained by the notion that we're all democracies. And when 27 heads of state, you know, sit at the council, they trust each other because they believe that all are elected through a democratic process and more or less adhere to the same values. And once you sort of dispense of that, and once you say, well, never mind, we'll have, you know, we don't need 27 democracies for the EU to function. Well, it's not going to function. It's going to break down. And you're seeing elements of it now with member states such as the Netherlands basically refusing to accept verdicts by the Polish justice system. And this is so it's going to compromise the EU's kind of legal architecture, and sooner or later, you know, all the various policies that we have, our common policies, are going to crumble. So that's what I'm trying to say, that it's not just about those values, although those are hugely important. It's also about the European Union not being able to survive in any other state than a union of democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michal. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you very much for your comments and thoughts. And of course, I give the floor now for the final thoughts in a minute or two, please, Professor Alemano.
Thank you. Well, obviously, I also agree on this pretty gloomy diagnosis. I would be even more cynical by saying that the scenario that Michael gave us, it's part of the reality of today. We already witness a coexistence of democracies and autocracies. We see the European legal regimes suspended, also because of COVID. We see the Schengen space already questioned with major restrictions, if you think about Ireland these days, which are manifestly against European law and free movement, basically discriminated based on nationality. We see the European judicial system in the mutual trust linking our judges already questioned, is no longer there. And even the European harmonization framework, if you look at the pharmaceutical, in this case, vaccines, being questioned because we are basically departing from an harmonized approach in this kind of emergency situation. So let's face it, Europe 2021 doesn't look as Europe 2018. There's a major acceleration in an implosion of the Union, where the political forces really struggle to find the right balance between fighting back, as you are doing, both of you in your respective political spaces, and those who are actually seizing this as an opportunity to make electoral goals and to basically score points and to advance their own political agenda. It is very sad to see Europe being treated once more as an object, as opposed to a subject and a common space of identity. A final point, since Irene asked me about, there are a lot of people in Europe, many academics, many professionals who really believe that it's worth giving support to people like you, to elected representatives of all Europeans as you are under the Treaty of Lisbon, and to provide support. That is the aim of the Good Lobby Profs. So we are more than 60 academics coming from all over Europe and also from outside of Europe, willing to basically help members of the European Parliament, national parliamentarians, but also civil society organizations and some of the victims of the major violations of the rule of law. That's what we've been trying to do. We have been launched also thanks to the support of some of your own communities only a few weeks ago. But since then, you cannot imagine how many requests for help we have been receiving from all different points, in particular on the LGBT free zones. We are helping now in Poland, but we have also matched, meaning we are providing this pro bono support to many other projects. So it's already running, and I really hope this will potentially trigger, although being just a little pilot, a little bit experiment, a bit of a drop in the ocean, it might trigger some positive dynamics that might also be picked up and perhaps inspire many other communities across Europe. This is our hope. But thank you so much for this opportunity and keep up with your great work.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much for taking the time and all of the comments. I will now switch to Slovenian because we're going to the second part of our round table.
I think that the debate in this first session was very welcome, particularly due to the situation in Slovenia that will be discussed now, because every day new problems emerge. It started immediately after the current government took office, and I could list all the problems till tomorrow, but we don't have the time available. But what is more, the things are intensified while Slovenia's presidency of the EU is just behind the corner. So I would first give the floor to the president of the Marjan Šarec list, President Šarec. We were able to hear that the issue of the rule of law is not an issue of national politics or ideology. It's also clear that we are not really doing well in Slovenia at this point. Did you ever imagine that things could go thus far? Yes, it's true. It's really difficult to understand the most recent developments. Knowing the politics of Janez Janša and the SDS, his party, well, it's not that difficult to imagine what's going on. The rule of law is the basic foundation of the European Union. It's the thing that it grew upon. And up until now, Slovenia has always advocated the rule of law. We never had problems with the rule of law. Now, this government actually positioned us on an agenda which runs contrary to everything. We are almost de facto a member of the Visegrad group, and this will undoubtedly also affect our presidency. This express desire of the Prime Minister to hold presidency has been is there, but there won't be any impact of it, or the impact will be contrary to what was desired. So we will only be isolated. This presidency has gone sour before it even started. As we could hear from the guest speakers over the last hour, it seems that everybody will only be anxiously awaiting for this presidency to be over and to be handed over to the next rotating presidency. What's going on currently in Slovenia shouldn't be happening in a modern European member state. And what was also interesting to hear, I think that it was said by Mr. Šimečka, it will be difficult for the European Union to survive if we have some countries that are democratic and others that are democratic on paper, but autocratic in reality. We are not currently on a good track. We're actually sinking in Slovenia. So we need to become aware in Slovenia that if we only observe this happen, if we do nothing and sit idle while this is happening, then it won't end well. Before we continue, perhaps we can get another look from outside. The Deputy Director of the International Press Institute is with us, Mr. Scott Griffin. In the Rule of Law report for 2020, and its chapter on Slovenia, said that with respect to the freedom of the media, the situation in Slovenia is problematic, and the report covered the time when those breaches have not even taken place yet. The current Prime Minister of Slovenia is obviously following the examples of Hungary and Poland, and the situation in Slovenia is a copy-paste of the methods used there. How would you, as an expert?
Sure. Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me well, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, I have to say, and a really important one. I'm going to come to your question, but I think it's important a little bit to understand where we are in terms of the trends of the wider region. And I think that I agree very much with what Michal was saying early on, that we are really in a race against time, I think, when it comes to defending media freedom, not only in Slovenia, but in the wider region. And if you look at the situation in Hungary and Poland, it's really very serious. And in particular, in the case of Hungary, the damage is severe. And it's something that has taken place slowly over the past 10 years, in which we now have a media environment which is almost completely captured by the state in one way or the other. And not only the media environment, but also many of the state institutions and structures which are part of the overall notion of the rule of law. If you look at the prosecutors, prosecutors' offices and judiciary in a wider sense. So it's a really very serious situation. I think I also completely agree with the previous speakers that, while we sit here talking about how to implement these different measures in the conditionality regime, we are seeing these negative trends accelerate. And then I point, for example, in Hungary to last month, in which the Klub Radio, which was the very last independent radio broadcaster in Hungary, was finally kicked off the air. And closed basically by an act of the state and an act of official censorship through the Media Council, which is a party-controlled body, completely controlled by Fidesz. These are very dramatic developments. Hungary is very far down this authoritarian road. If you look at Poland, we are in a slightly different place. I think we can speak in a way that Poland is on a precipice. That we have some very alarming trends in Poland, which are not exactly the same in Hungary, but mirror those trends in different ways towards this concept of state capture. But we are in a moment where it's not clear how bad things will get, although we are deeply concerned. And I point to a couple of recent developments. We've seen now a state-controlled oil company which has purchased the leading publisher of regional media in Poland from the former German owner, which is in its own an alarming picture, I think, but raises serious concerns about the future of independent media in Poland and the ability of the government to determine the editorial line of a huge number of media. And that actually has been blocked by a court temporarily, which I think is a very important development and a sign of the interlinks between judicial independence and media freedom. And another alarming development actually today was the ruling by the Constitutional Court, which it looks like will kick the human rights ombudsman Adam Bodnar out of office, which is actually a negative example of the interlinks between judicial independence and media freedom. Mr. Bodnar has been a vocal supporter of media independence. When we talk about Slovenia, I think we are in a slightly different situation. It's obvious that Slovenia is not as far down the road as Hungary and Poland, but the serious troubling signs are there. And I think that, this is the moment where we need a very strong intervention. And we see that the damage by the lack of intervention, in particular by the European Commission, but by other parties as well, in Hungary and Poland. I don't want to say the situation in Hungary is irreversible, because no situation is irreversible, but it is very far down the road, and Poland is moving quickly too. So I think in Slovenia, we are at a moment where we really need to grapple with these threats to media freedom and counter them now as strongly as we can. And I think it's difficult to say that Slovenia is a copy somehow of Hungary, because each country has a slightly different media market. There are different forces at play, but we do see that some of the same types of ways to delegitimize and undermine the work of critical journalism are taking place here in Slovenia. I think there are two big ones at the moment. One are the constant verbal attacks, threats, and harassment of critical journalists, of independent journalists in Slovenia by some of the country's highest political officials, including the president. And this is a very serious topic, and I'm happy that Vice President Jourova raised it as well. And we really do feel that these attacks are placing journalists, independently of the fact that they undermine public trust in the media, and they sort of make it much more difficult for journalists to do their jobs, to reach the public, and to exercise this watchdog role. I think there are legitimate concerns as well about the physical safety of journalists. The more people are told that journalists are traitors, that they are enemies, that they are somehow antithetical to national values, I think that people will begin to see them as targets, and that's something that's extremely concerning to us. And the second major issue right now, which has been raised several times, are the attacks on public media, both on the public broadcaster as well on the national news agency. And this absolutely mirrors trends that we've seen in other countries, in Hungary and Poland. Our experience is that when it comes to these efforts to systematically shift the media environment towards a pro-government media environment, that public media are usually the first chips to fall, so to speak. In a way, they're the easiest target. And I don't mean to say anything negative about public media. It's just because of their close links to this, to the public, to public bodies, the way that the funding is, it tends to be easier for governments to undermine the work of public broadcasting. And we know that, in Hungary and Poland, the public broadcasters there don't even deserve the name. They're nothing more than propaganda instruments. And I think that's why it is right to fight very hard for the existence of independent public media, as well as a public news agency in Slovenia. They play an extremely important role in informing the public. I think particularly in smaller media environments, smaller media markets, such as Slovenia. and these developments can happen very quickly. I mean, it was just shortly after the Peace Party took power in Poland that critical journalists were switched out at the public broadcaster, and we saw a complete shift towards a pro-government message, which was very evident also during last year's presidential elections. And Hungary, of course, is very much in the throes of propaganda, public media. So I think that, again, we can't say that Slovenia is Hungary. It isn't. But I think our work should be focused on ensuring that it doesn't become Hungary. It doesn't become Poland, and that is why I think the focus on the media freedom developments in Slovenia are very important, and it's absolutely legitimate that we are putting a lot of emphasis and priority on these topics at the moment.
Najlepša hvala. Gospa Zakonšek, zdaj grem k vam. Vi ste specialistka za medijsko pravo. Vem, da ste imeli oziroma da imate veliko strah.
And I know that you had and still have many clients from the media sphere. Over the last year, the situation has deteriorated also when it comes to discreditation of journalists. How much more work are you having, and what is your take on the situation? Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, it's true, like you said. For attorneys, I can say that probably we are not going to run out of work, but we have also noticed, and that's also quite concerning, that there is a certain degree of resignation on the part of journalists, because recently, over the last few months, there have been so many attacks that they really have a hard time reacting. And also because of this COVID situation in Slovenia, like elsewhere in Europe and globally, there is also the question of legal procedures, funding, and they're also asking themselves whether they will have enough funds to go through legal proceedings and so on. So I agree with the previous speakers. The situation is a very worrying one, and I believe that it's not enough and that it's not reasonable or sensible to just wait. No, I think we have to react to as many phenomena as we can. I think that we are in a situation where we cannot leave people to try and resolve their individual situations. Thank you very much. Professor Milosavljević, we have to mention the communication of Janez Janša. Of course, his tweets are one thing, and I'm not saying that you can write on Twitter just anything you want to, but then there is another thing when it comes to communication with members of the European Parliament, Commission, politicians who dare to object his views. You also were not spared after you presented your views in the European Parliament. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Today, I can say that anybody who dares to criticize the government, the Prime Minister, or any of the key members of the government, they simply have to bear in mind that they are going to become a target of a systematic and coordinated attack. But this is our new reality, and probably the purpose is the so-called chilling effect, trying to intimidate discreetly or less discreetly other people who might decide to speak out publicly. And we have seen this with many people. We have seen preemptive strikes in other countries as well. So attacks are planned on people who might potentially be dangerous or who might be competitors or who just might speak. Now, speaking about a broader concept, governments, prime ministers, communication with the public, with the media and the journalists, of course, one needs to take into account that this is a method that has simply not been present in Slovenia before. In the past, we have seen communication taking place in Slovenia at another level, regardless of the tabloids and other media that might have been vulgar, aggressive, primitive in certain instances, but social media did not enable them. Of course, 15 years ago, we didn't have social media. My Life, Second Life were not relevant social media platforms to pronounce somebody's views. But over the last 10 years, we have seen an important shift, and it has escalated importantly. And what we have seen over the past year was that it has happened very quickly. But this shouldn't surprise us. If we saw the communication of some people, and we did so, be it in at a political level or otherwise, then we should not be surprised by attacks on the National Press Agency, the Pop TV, people with names and owners. We can be surprised by the method or level of vulgarity or attitude towards female journalists or editors. And I'm sure that there is a certain degree of sexism behind that. But we should not be surprised by that. The key question now is, what can we do? Mr. Šarec, you too participated at meetings in Brussels, and probably you could share your personal experience, or from a political point of view, have you observed grouping or networking among certain politicians? Because now we can see the current prime minister acting completely differently than you did. Maybe you are contacted by some politicians asking you what the hell is going on. Well, in politics, there are no friendships, there are just shared interests. And it's quite normal in politics, also in the EU, that there are some ad hoc alliances that are formed on particular issues. For example, when it comes to cohesion, Slovenia is acting together with cohesion countries. When it comes to the rule of law, everybody knows who is supporting the rule of law and who is not. So in my times, Slovenia was not problematic. Of course, we were being attacked at home that nobody knows about us, but we were not a problematic country because in the past, Slovenia never held anti-EU positions. We never publicly supported infringements on human rights and other things that have been debated today. And if you remember, I myself made a call that state-owned companies should not advertise in the media supporting hostile speech. No particular medium was mentioned, and yet SDS supported media started to criticize me. So they obviously recognized themselves because I never mentioned any names. And back then, some people could not understand what I was talking about. Also, back in 2018, nobody or not many understood why we were working so hard on forming a minority government. Now you know why. If we didn't put together the minority government back in 2018, then it's quite questionable where we would be today. But now let me continue responding to Mr. Milosavljevic. What can we do right now? We should all do whatever is in our power not to succumb. Maybe I will be nasty towards journalists. Of course, we politicians, some people say we simply have to be used to certain attacks. Yes, okay, but I have been targeted by some media all the time. So to me, this is nothing new. These attacks come for my breakfast, but for journalists who are used having civilized politics, who are used to receiving an answer to the question, who are used to a democratic society here in Slovenia, for people who never thought something like this could happen in Slovenia, well, that's a shock. This comes as a shock. But that's on purpose, because some people want to intimidate them. If you have a look at what is happening to the National Press Agency, this is like a siege. This is like starving them of funds, and they want to starve them for as long as it takes in order for them, for the STA, to give in. I think we should not show any fear. That would be the biggest mistake. We should not be intimidated. We should not show any fear and say loud and clear, we are going to fight back. We are fighting back. And the situation in Slovenia will never go as far as it did in some other countries, because we are here to fight back. You should know that there is not so much of this extremism, but it's very loud. And it's loud because we, Slovenians, we don't like to expose ourselves, to speak out. And this is very fertile ground for extremists. It's not only them who are to blame, but also those who are allowing this. So let's not be afraid. Let's not have any doubts whether we are doing the right thing. We are doing the right thing, and Slovenia should go back to the right track. And we should make sure that this will be just an episode and not a situation. Mr. Griffin, I'm going to ask you about Janša's communication. Yes, you said Slovenia is not Hungary, it's not Poland, but it's on the way there, and that's what I said as well. But listening to Janša's rhetoric and seeing his actions, what does this mean for foreign policy? We see the Prime Minister attacking journalists from everywhere, not just Slovenian journalists.
Well, I'm sure that it certainly doesn't help his reputation in some circles. But I think the main thing is for me, going back to what other speakers were talking about, is the effect on self-censorship and sort of the impact that it has on journalists being able to do their jobs. And I think, unfortunately, it's a willful or not misunderstanding of what journalism is. Journalism is by nature critical. Journalism is by nature adversarial. A journalism which is not irritating, annoying, criticizing and questioning politicians isn't journalism. And that, I think, understanding is obviously or it doesn't appear to be there. And I, it's not our role. We're not a political organization. It's not our role to speak about the Prime Minister's reputation. We're really more interested in how we can defend journalists, and I think ensure that they remain empowered to do their jobs, which is asking tough questions and being adversarial, even in a difficult environment such as Slovenia, where journalists are being attacked, where they are being smeared, and where they are being delegitimized. And part of that is raising awareness about these cases, and the other part is providing support to journalists who are the targets of such attacks, which is what we are trying to do in different ways together with our partners. This is, on the one hand, obviously moral support, but obviously practical and legal support. We have our Media Freedom Rapid Response, which we belong to, which is providing legal support, or which has the ability to provide legal support to journalists who are under threat, to provide practical support to journalists who are under threat, and raise these cases at a higher level so that they receive the attention that they deserve, and journalists feel that they are not alone. and it's explaining to media outlets how they can protect their staff who feel threatened and who therefore feel that they don't want to write about certain topics. Because they will be attacked online, they will be the victim of trolls, and I don't think that these issues, unfortunately, I don't see them disappearing in the short term. So we're really looking at how we can, as I said, ensure that journalists are empowered and they don't give in to this temptation of self-censorship, which I can understand or I can imagine is a big one. If you feel you are being attacked from the biggest political office in the country with a huge number of followers, it's going to have an impact, whether you admit it or not, on your self-confidence and ability to do your job. And I think this is a key area where we need to work on. And I think this is really the micro response to the problem. I think the macro response is again coming back to the wider regional issues. That the lack of response in Hungary and Poland. I do think it is, giving space to other leaders who are antagonistic to the media, who want to undermine the role of media in society, and the lack of action, not only over the past 10 years in Hungary, but even now as we sit here, the lack of concrete results in terms of European Union, European Commission responses to the flouting of fundamental rights in Hungary and Poland. Again, I think it's accelerating these trends in both in those countries, but in other countries like Slovenia as well. So unless you deal with those root problems, these issues are going to stay with us. And maybe a third point, the attacks, the verbal attacks on journalists, the smear campaigns are a huge issue, and we need to deal with them. But I think we also need to keep an eye on these other structural, I would say, threats to the public broadcaster, to the news agency, because these are also issues that at the end of the day will severely impact the public's right to information. The attacks are very loud, but what is also going on behind the scenes in terms of bringing media in line with a government message. And I think it's also important here to note the investment by Fidesz in the Slovenian media landscape, that we also shouldn't be distracted and forget about these also fundamental issues which are happening in the background. And that's why we are also as IPI trying to really shed a light on these as well, to ensure that the news agency, that the public broadcaster, but also that the wider media landscape remains a pluralistic media landscape. And that also involves, supporting media, supporting journalists financially to ensure that this landscape can remain, and that we don't end up with a completely one-sided media market as we do it right now in Hungary.
Now, before we continue, we are going to go on for another 15 minutes, the academic quota, and then we are going to wrap up. So my next question is for Mrs. Zakonjšek and the National Press Agency. I would like to know about your view about the infringement of the STA Act. We know that the director has allowed access to the government into documentation, but what to do next? What would be the best legal moves now to make sure that the money is paid to the National Press Agency, which by law should have been done long ago? Well, if I can, for just a minute, go back to what the previous speakers have been talking about. Of course, it's quite clear that journalists are public personalities, meaning that their work can be criticized, and that's also confirmed by the Court of Human Rights, and that's also confirmed by Slovenian courts. So You can criticize journalists' work. You can criticize it sharply, but just as long as you're criticizing the work, when it comes to personal attacks, which might be camouflaged as attacks on their work, well, then this is no longer something that journalists should be putting up with. It's true that the journalists have to be tough. Sometimes they try to be too tough. Even female journalists have we seen in the past. But what I wanted to say was that the current government, and of course it's not the only government that doesn't like journalists reporting. As Mr. Griffin said, because of the nature of their work, journalists are not liked by any government, simply because journalists tend to ask uncomfortable questions, questions that the government probably doesn't want to debate publicly. But recently, over the recent months and years, not just in Slovenia, but also in other democracies, the United States are a very good example. So we have seen how the attacks have intensified, and probably also the effects. Another thing I wanted to mention was that Slovenia, and the same goes for Poland and Hungary, well, these countries are not the only one to be facing them. We know that those who criticize the government, not just journalists, but also academics, are being attacked. We have recently seen the phenomenon of slap lawsuits, lawsuits that are not intended to win, but instead the effect or the purpose is to silence journalists or anybody else criticizing the government. This phenomenon is not something typical of Slovenia only. The United States has quite a lot of experience with that, and I know that the EU is preparing certain mechanisms to make sure that slap lawsuits don't happen or that their impact is minimized. Now, on the National Press Agency, maybe for a lawyer, the situation is quite unusual because this is a very specific question that is being resolved through a legislative intervention, because in principle, laws are intended to be general, to cover general situations. So for lawyers, it's sometimes very difficult to grasp the situation. I think, however, that it is only right that legal mechanisms too should be used in order for the National Press Agency to be able to function normally. But as I was saying, the situation has come so far that the National Press Agency situation is now being resolved in a manner that is not at all normal when it comes to providing funding for the agency. So judging from outside, it's quite difficult to make any comment on legal proceedings simply because they are so unusual. Thank you very much, Mr. Milosavljevic. What would you like to see happening in Slovenia in the sphere of the media? I cannot hear you, Mr. Milosavljevic. Yes, I forgot to unmute myself. Well, this is a question that we could discuss until tomorrow, but if we are realistic and we are speaking in short term, the current situation is like this. We have a circle of very active people and their supporters on Twitter who are trying to create an impression that the general public opinion is as they would like to see it. On the other hand, we have some public media, such as the national TV and the National Press Agency. And I think that the current government is very well aware that their space of support is an echo chamber where people, their supporters, are telling the same thing over and over again. And if they want to be more successful, they simply have to extend their impact on other media, public media. And the first targets are certainly the national TV, the National Press Agency, which would probably be followed by agreements with owners of private radio and TV stations or even printed media. Agreements in the sense of intimidating them or maybe trying to strike an agreement in order for them to reduce their level of criticism. Now, what could perhaps be done in this space and at this point in time is to have a systematic approach of the democratic and critical public in Slovenia. So all institutions, all levels of our society that have been attacked or intimidated, and the list is very long, well, they should show their democratic posture in one way or another. I'm speaking about the prosecutor's office, the constitutional court, the statistical office has been attacked, the museums have been attacked, the court of auditors has been attacked, and many, many other institutions. Democratic institution is based on division of powers and a variety of institutions. The role of the media, as Mr. Griffin said, is that of criticism. A former editor of Guardian 100 years ago said that everything that the journalist should do and publish are things that somebody wants to hide. That's the role of journalism. Everything else is PR. So the role of journalism is not what it used to be during the time of communism or socialism, which might be very close to some people from the current government, because some people in the current government are former members of the Communist Party. But the role of the media today is not that of propaganda. Journalists are not political workers reporting what a politician has said. No, journalists should check facts. They should ask uncomfortable questions. And if journalists continue to do that in the future, if owners continue to stand by their journalists, and if they respond to the attack on themselves and on the entire media sphere, and if in addition to that, other institutions also make their voices heard, and I'm speaking about theaters, courts, prosecutors, and so on, well, then it's doable in the short run. In the very short run, however, we are speaking about relationships in the parliament. We are talking about questions of the current coalition. We are talking about changing some deputies' mindset. Do they really want to live in this country, in a Slovenia like this?
Thank you. And I will now give each of you a minute or perhaps even less for really final thoughts. First, Mr. Šarec, my final thought will be that sometimes the facts are more bizarre than fiction. And I think that this sentence can really illustrate well what we were discussing in the second session. Yes, I agree. And I have to say that I also entirely agree with what was just said by Mr. Milosavljević. I think that this is the essence of it all. If Giulio Andreotti, who used to be prime minister on several occasions, said that you should never correct yourself in the media because by doing so you will only recall what was done wrong, he knew that you should not argue with the media, that they act as their own power, and I can only agree. And I also agree that the role of the media is different today. And what was just mentioned is key. We should all stand up. We should all get engaged and also become involved also when the time comes for the elections. Not that we all now are voicing concerns and then not act during elections. This is a self-protective action. And this is how we can protect a democracy. And only by doing so, things can change. I think that this is vital. We should not become intimidated. We should not stand idle. And it's true, extremes are always loud because this is why they're called extremes. Mr. Griffin, perhaps your final thoughts. What should we take from today's discussion? I think it was really interesting. We held it for...
Yeah, I mean, I would just highlight in the end the systemic or systematic nature of the problem that we have in Hungary and Poland. And I think it relates to what the two previous speakers were talking about, involving, all democratic institutions, because this is what we saw in Hungary, that the control of the state, we're not just talking about media freedom, also as Jasna was saying, that we see state control over numerous aspects of public life and different types of public institutions. Academic freedom is restricted, civil society, the activities of civil society are restricted, the activities of the public prosecutor are restricted, judiciary is compromised, and there's an interplay between all of these actors, the media, whatever the media comes up with in Hungary, whatever investigations come out, it's extremely difficult to have an impact if every other institution is co-opted. And I think that also what Mr. Milosavljević was mentioning, we really worry about the future of other democratic institutions besides the media, and I think that it makes sense to have this kind of coalition of institutions of democratic governance and democratic life, and maybe again also as part of this systemic threat. Again, it's not just for us, the individual attacks on journalists. It's not individual criticism, a criticism there or a harsh criticism there. It's the systemic nature of it. It's a comprehensive effort to use certain narratives to undermine the work of journalists and to basically tarnish their reputation in front of the public. And it's not just the individual situation of one media outlet. It's the larger systematic effort to infiltrate the media market. And as Mr. Milosavljević was also mentioning, the fear that, this will not stop at public media, but it will eventually target also private media and somehow, using different levers of state power, which is what we saw in Hungary, using different public institutions that were co-opted by the Fidesz party to bring private media under control. And these are the types of developments that we need to be extremely vigilant about and ensure that we don't end up again with this type of completely co-opted media market that we have in Hungary and Poland. Slovenia still has media pluralism. It still has a vibrant media. It still has a lot of tons of courageous journalists who are doing their job. And that is what we need to preserve.
Hvala lepa, gospa Zakonšek. Še vas zaključek na kratko, prosim.
Thank you very much. Madam Zakonjšek, your conclusions? Well, I can share my perspective. I can also end on a more optimistic note. I think it's really, really important what was just mentioned by the previous speakers, namely that democracies do not rely solely on the freedom of the media. They also rely on justice. And here I see most links to the fact that we still trust our judicial system. I hope that this trust is preserved. And also the European Court of Human Rights has always passed decisions on the freedom of the media. These decisions are very often quoted. Judges know these decisions very well. And I do agree, we should not only focus on the media, but on all democratic institutions. I hope that optimism is well placed, and of course, this optimism should not really keep us idle. I do think also that the international attention is welcome because it gives us an impression that we are not in this alone. Yes, thank you very much. I do fully agree with you. Mr. Milosavljević, your final minute, if you please. Yes, thank you very much. Well, in the short run, to quote a Slovene political speaker, I'd say the next 2 weeks will be decisive because soon we will be getting a new Director General of the national broadcaster. And I think it will also be really clear what the government intends to do with regard to the SDA. It will become clear whether it wants to resolve the situation in a week or two or whether it wants to prolong the situation. We'll see what will happen now that it has gotten access to all the documents. So I think that it will be clear very quickly what is going to happen. But generally, I think what is important is the general attitude by the public. We as people should be aware that we live in the European Union. We live in democratic times. The times of totalitarian regimes are behind us. We should all work to preserve this democracy. And this democracy should function to the benefit of us, to the benefit of Europe, to the benefit of the European values, to the benefit of our future. And this is why we have worked so hard for so many years to become a member of the European Union. For that reason, we need to be decisive and we should not have any fear. We should be aware that people also in public life can function aggressively, they can act as bullies, but they can only succeed if people keep quiet and get afraid. If people speak up, if they act decisively, such situations can be quickly dispelled, even in the current term of the National Assembly or in the future terms. Thank you very much. I can only subscribe to these words, and I would really like to thank all the 4 speakers very cordially. I would also like to thank the interpreters, everybody else on the team. I would also like to thank the entire audience for your patience. We have extended this debate for a bit, but I hope you do not mind because I thought that this was such an important debate that I really did not want to interrupt the speakers or shorten the debate. So I do hope that you got new insights from this debate. I do think that we've opened up many issues, but we also came up with many possible answers. And I do hope that it won't end with words this time. So thank you very much to all the guests and speakers.